In September of 1408, in a small stone church on the Greenland coast, a young woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir married a man called Thorstein Olafsson. 2 priests read the banns. A certificate was issued. By every visible measure, it was an ordinary wedding. The couple sailed for Iceland soon after, and that was the last time anyone ever heard from the Vikings of Greenland. A colony of up to 5,000 people, established for nearly 5 centuries, simply stopped existing. No bodies, no records, no goodbye. When a Norwegian missionary arrived in 1721 expecting a thriving Christian settlement, he found abandoned farms and silent churches. For 100 years, the explanation never changed. They were stubborn. They refused to adapt. Then modern scientific study began reading the bones, the soil, and the genetic record itself. And what it found was not what anyone had been told. The man who built the colony was a killer. Erik Thorvaldsson, known as Erik the Red for the color of his hair and beard, had inherited the family problem long before he ever saw Greenland. His father, Thorvald, had been banished from Norway for manslaughter and had dragged 10-year-old Erik west to Iceland to start over. Starting over did not take. Erik grew into his father's temperament with interest. Following a dispute over some borrowed wooden beams, he killed 2 of his neighbor's sons, and the Icelandic legal system made its position clear. 3 years of banishment. The Viking world was not a gentle one, but Erik had crossed even its line. The direction of his exile was decided by geography. East was the Norway his family had already been banned from. South was the open Atlantic. West was a rumor. Around the year 900, a lost sailor named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had been blown off course and glimpsed land on the far horizon. He never went ashore. He returned with the story and nothing else. For 80 years, that sighting sat in the Icelandic imagination as something between a legend and a navigational footnote. Erik sailed toward it in 982. What he found first was not encouraging. The eastern coast of Greenland is a wall of ice and black rock, unbroken for hundreds of miles, a coastline that announces itself as uninhabitable and means it. So he pressed south. He rounded the brutal southern tip that later mariners would call Cape Farewell and began working up the western shore. And the landscape changed. The ice gave way to deep fjords, sheltered valleys, grass growing where grass had no business growing, seals along the coast, seabirds overhead. It was not Iceland. It was not Norway. But it was enough. He spent the full 3 years of his exile exploring it, camping on islands, sailing deep into the fjords, naming places, finding the pockets of fertile land that would one day become farms. And when his sentence ended, he returned to Iceland with a plan that depended on convincing several hundred people to abandon everything and follow a convicted killer across the North Atlantic to a country none of them had ever seen. So he lied. He called it Greenland. The sagas, written long after his death, say he chose the name precisely because people would be drawn to a place that sounded green. It was the 10th century equivalent of an estate agent calling a cramped studio flat cozy. And it worked. In 986, 25 ships left Iceland, packed with livestock, tools, and roughly 500 hopeful settlers. Only 14 made it. The survivors built their farms along the southwestern coast, and Erik took the finest land of all for himself, a sprawling estate called Brattahlid at the head of a beautiful fjord. The twice-banished killer had made himself king of his own country. The first generation discovered quickly what the land would and would not give them. They had brought cattle, sheep, and goats from Iceland, and they set about rebuilding the farming life they had known. In the short summer season, they raised what little they could. They made cheese and butter from their livestock. They hunted seal and caribou along the coast. The fjords gave them fish. The cliffs gave them seabirds. Now and then a whale washed ashore and fed a settlement for weeks. It was workable. It was not comfortable. and the limitations were severe and permanent. There were almost no trees on the island, which meant no timber for ships or houses. There was virtually no iron ore, which meant no tools or weapons of their own making. Grain would not grow reliably in the climate, which meant no bread without imports. The driftwood that washed onto the beaches was so valuable that community leaders rationed it. It was forbidden to be burned for heat or for cooking. For fuel, they turned to the peat bogs, which Greenland had in abundance. For walls, they turned to dry stone, insulated with animal fur. Within a single generation, they had engineered a working Arctic society out of almost nothing. By the early 11th century, the population had reached somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000. And then, across the 12th and 13th centuries, the colony entered what can only be called a golden age. The driver of it was a single commodity. Every summer, hunting parties sailed roughly 1,500 kilometers north to the grounds near what is now Disco Bay. The journey was dangerous. The payoff was the most valuable raw material in medieval Europe: walrus ivory. European traders at the time had no reliable access to African elephant tusks, which made walrus the prestige material of the entire continent. It was carved into crucifixes, into bishops' croziers, into ornate book covers, into ornaments for the houses of the wealthy, and the Greenlanders sat on a seemingly inexhaustible supply of it. The wider trade ran deeper still: walrus hide, cut into ropes strong enough to rig the largest ships in Europe. Fox fur, seal oil, polar bear pelts, live polar bears occasionally shipped as royal gifts for kings who wanted them for no reason beyond the status of owning one. Narwhal tusks, sold to a gullible elite who believed them to be genuine unicorn horns. Gerfalcons, the magnificent Arctic hunting birds, worth more than their weight in gold. In return, ships from Bergen arrived with the essentials the colony could not produce: iron tools, weapons, timber, grain for bread, wine and candles for the churches. Without any of it, the colony could not function. And this is the part to hold on to. The Greenland Vikings did not survive on Greenland's resources. They survived on one export, sold to one trading partner across one shipping route. 5 centuries of civilization resting on a single economic beam. And beams can break. For most of the 20th century, the explanation for what happened here was fixed. It appeared in textbooks. It appeared in documentaries. It appeared in academic papers, treated as settled. And the story was simple and satisfying, which is usually the first clue that a story is wrong. The Norse, it was said, were rigid Europeans who carried their farming traditions into the Arctic and refused to let them go. They clung to cattle when cattle no longer made sense. They clung to sheep when the grass stopped growing. They ignored the Inuit, who were thriving all around them, because the Inuit were heathens, and the Norse were too proud to learn from a people they considered beneath them. They starved to death with their European dignity intact. The moral was neat and easy: a civilization killed by its own arrogance. It was a compelling narrative. It was also largely false. The evidence that unseated it did not come from new historical documents, because none existed. It came from the bones themselves. When a person eats, the chemistry of their food is written permanently into their skeleton. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes in particular leave a fingerprint so specific that a skilled researcher can read from a single bone fragment whether that person ate mostly land animals, mostly sea animals, or some combination of the two. The technique is called stable isotope analysis, and across the last few decades it has been applied systematically to Norse remains recovered all across Greenland. The results did not match the old story. They contradicted it completely. In the earliest generations of the colony, the bones show exactly what the traditional narrative predicts. Roughly 80% of the Norse diet came from land-based farming: beef, mutton, dairy. The food of a European agricultural society transplanted to the Arctic. This is the starting point everyone expected. What came next was not. Across the following centuries, the ratio shifted, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. By the final generations of the colony, the proportions had almost exactly reversed. Roughly 80% of the Norse diet was now coming from the sea, mostly seal. Stop and think about what that actually means. A society that refuses to adapt does not rebuild its entire food system from the ground up. That is not what stubbornness looks like. That is what a population in full, desperate, continuous transformation looks like. The Greenland Vikings were not clinging to their European traditions. They were abandoning them as fast as the next generation could be taught to hunt, and the archaeology says the same thing in a different language. Tools for sea mammal hunting multiplying in the record. Clothing adapted for the coast. Farmsteads consolidating as families moved toward the water and away from the failing inland pastures. Everything the Norse could change, they changed. Which forces the question the old story never had to answer. If these people were adapting as hard as they possibly could, then what killed them? Because something did. The answer sits in three places: the climate, the market, and the neighbors. Start with the climate. Eric the Red's Greenland was not quite the lie it has always been made out to be. When he made landfall on the western coast in 982, he arrived inside a climatic window that scientists now call the medieval warm period. For roughly 3 centuries, Arctic temperatures ran unusually mild. Grass grew in the fjords. Livestock could graze outdoors for meaningful stretches of the year. The sea routes to Europe stayed navigable across most seasons. The fantasy of Viking farming at the top of the world was, briefly, not a fantasy at all. Eric's marketing was aggressive, but for the first few generations, the climate genuinely cooperated with it. Around the year 1300, that window closed. What came next is now known as the Little Ice Age, a period of dramatic cooling that gripped the northern hemisphere for centuries. In Greenland, average annual temperatures dropped by roughly 1 degree. That number sounds far too small to matter. For a farming society already operating at the absolute limit of what was possible, it was enough to break the back of the entire enterprise. And the mechanism was simple and unforgiving. Shorter growing seasons meant less hay. Less hay meant the livestock had to be kept indoors for longer each winter, consuming stored feed faster than the following summer could replenish it. Fewer calves survived. Herds shrank. Dairy production collapsed. Every farm in the colony entered the same slow, compounding spiral at roughly the same moment. Pollen recovered from Greenland's lake sediments confirms the retreat of grasses across exactly this period. The agricultural base of the society was dying, and it was dying everywhere at once. The cold was only the first layer. Sea ice began pushing further south each year, closing the Disco Bay hunting routes for more and more months at a stretch. The summer walrus hunts, the economic engine that had funded 4 centuries of imports, became increasingly dangerous and increasingly unreliable. Ships from Bergen found the approaches to the coast harder to navigate, and the window in which trade could safely happen shrank year by year. The colony had been built on the assumption of open water. The water was closing. Then came the sea itself. Across the full span of the Norse occupation, sea levels along the coast rose by roughly 3 meters. The rise was gradual, measured in centimeters per generation, which is why it took so long to understand. But the geography of the colony was uniquely vulnerable to it. The best farmland, the flat, fertile ground along the fjords, was exactly where the water came in first. Hundreds of square miles of the colony's most valuable land was quietly, steadily reclaimed by the ocean. The inland pastures were failing. The coastal pastures were drowning. And then, in 1348, the Black Death reached Norway. There is no archaeological or genetic evidence that the plague itself ever reached Greenland. The distance, the cold, and the increasingly thin shipping traffic may well have spared the colony from direct infection. It did not matter, because Greenland had spent 400 years building its entire external relationship around a single trading partner. and that partner was Bergen. Across the winter of 1349, in the space of roughly 6 months, the Black Death killed an estimated 60% of the Norwegian population. The trading agreements, the shipping families, the generational merchant relationships that Greenland had spent centuries cultivating, all of it was gone inside half a year. And the Norway that survived was in no position to resume transatlantic shipping on any recognizable timeline. Every surviving hand was needed at home. Every coastal town had lost its sailors. Every port had lost its ships. For a distant colony that had never been a strategic priority for anyone in Europe, the plague was not a near miss. It was the permanent severing of the one line that had held the colony in place. The ships from Bergen had carried the iron, the timber, the grain, the weapons, and the wine. Now the ships were not coming, and without them, a society that could not produce its own metal or its own bread was left with no way to replace what it could not make. The church was the second line, and it went next. In 1378, the last bishop of Greenland, a man named Alf, died in the eastern settlement. No replacement was ever sent. The papal records contain a handful of later documents that discuss the idea of appointing a new bishop, but the question was treated increasingly as a theoretical one for a diocese that no one in Rome could reliably reach. The Church, the institution that had tied Greenland to European Christendom for nearly 4 centuries, quietly let the colony go. And this is the configuration that the modern evidence has forced into focus. The colony did not die because of one thing. It died because 3 separate load-bearing beams broke inside a single lifetime. The climate that had made farming possible, the market that had made imports possible, and the trading partner that had made contact possible. Any one of those losses on its own might have been survivable. A society can absorb a single blow and reorganize itself around the wound. The 3 together were not survivable. There was nothing left to reorganize around. The Norse adapted because the bones say they adapted. They changed their diet, their tools, their clothing, the very places they lived. But there were some things that no adaptation could reach. You cannot eat your way out of a market that has stopped buying. You cannot hunt your way out of a partner that has stopped sailing. And while the Norse were losing everything, another people had been moving steadily toward them for centuries. They were called the Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, and they had been migrating east across the Canadian Arctic for centuries, following the seals and the whales, expanding into territory that had once been held by an older culture called the Dorset. By the 14th century, they had reached the northern edges of the Norse world. The 2 peoples met, and for a time, they traded. Norse metal goods have been recovered from Thule sites scattered across the Arctic, carried north through contact that began peacefully enough. Then in 1379, the Icelandic annals record an attack on the eastern settlement. The Norse called the attackers Skraelings, the word they used for all the indigenous peoples of the region. 18 men were killed. No surviving record describes what happened at the western settlement, but the archaeology is unambiguous. Farmsteads burned, possessions left where they lay, an abandonment that looks hurried rather than gradual, the signature of a population that left quickly and did not come back. The old narrative treated this as a simple story, primitive raiders falling on a weakened civilization. The modern evidence tells something far more uncomfortable. The Thule were not primitive. They were the opposite. They were a people whose entire technology, their clothing, their diet, their housing, their hunting, their whole social organization had been refined across thousands of years for precisely the Arctic conditions that were now overwhelming the Norse. Kayaks the Norse had no equivalent for. Toggle-headed harpoons that took seal more efficiently than anything the Greenlanders possessed. Winter dwellings that held heat far better than stone walls insulated with fur. By every measure that now mattered, the environment favored the newcomers. Even adapting as hard as they could, the Norse were running a race that a better adapted people was winning by default. The final phase is recorded in small, sad details. The Western settlement vanishes from the record entirely. Sometime in the mid-1400, a Norwegian official named Ivar Barderson, sent to investigate, reported finding livestock running wild and not a single person left. The eastern settlement held on for several more generations, but its population shrank every decade. Farms consolidated, outlying steadings were abandoned. The cathedrals that had once served a thriving parish served fewer and fewer worshippers each year. And then the wedding at H. Valsey in 1408. Sigrid and Thorstein married before two priests in a settlement that still functioned just well enough to issue a certificate. They sailed for Iceland soon after, and after that, there is nothing. No chronicler records the end. No ship returns with news of a catastrophe. No mass grave has ever been found. The archaeology suggests the truth was not dramatic. Sometimes a population does not end in disaster. Sometimes it ends in arithmetic. A birth rate slightly below a death rate, sustained across decades until one winter there is simply no one left. For over 300 years, the answer lay frozen in the ground, waiting for someone with the right tools to read it. The bones, the isotopes, the pollen in the lake beds, the drowned pastures and the empty farmsteads. Together, they tell a story that the history books got wrong for a century. The Greenland Norse did not die because they were stubborn. They did not die because they refused to change. They changed what they ate. They changed how they hunted. They changed where they lived. They changed everything they could change. What they could not change was the climate beneath their feet, the market across the ocean, or the plague in a city they had never seen. They were a civilization that did everything right by the measure of its own resilience and lost anyway. The bones remember it. The ice remembers it. We simply needed to learn how to listen.